Welcome everyone to my YouTube channel. This is Video Chess Training, and I'm International Master Will Paschall. Today we're going to take a look at one of my recent games, actually my most recent game, and in the theory that, according to world champion Videi, the most important thing you can do to better your game is to actually deeply analyze your own games. I think analysis of any sort of master games, especially those annotated by strong players themselves, is very valuable, but perhaps nothing is as valuable as a deep analysis of your own games. So I thought for an interesting video here today, we're going to take a look at one of my own recent games and sort of go through this together. I have analyzed this very lightly on my own, but to be honest, we're kind of doing this for the first time together here. So this is a recent game from the Budapest Team Championship. I didn't know who I was going to play, and sometimes that's possible, to actually know who your opponent is before the game. In this case, I wasn't sure at all, so I basically couldn't prepare any particular opening for any particular player. So I sat down against an older gentleman, probably in his late 60s, perhaps 70 years old, and his name is J.Havasi. This is Hungarian team tournament. It's actually the Budapest Team Championship. So this guy, despite the fact that I've been here in Hungary since 2004, and I've also been here even before that, playing in other tournaments, hadn't run into this player, and I wasn't sure how strong he is, but it turns out that he was a Videi master, and his maximum rating was around 2310, something like that. So he'd managed to get the Videi master title, but there is the danger of underestimating your opponent, and I opened here with knight f3. This is a move that I've been playing a lot lately, and I feel it's a very safe move for white. This is kind of my default to avoid overly sharp theory against opponents, especially when I don't really know what they play. It's a good idea to kind of err on the side of caution, I think, when you don't know what you're up against. So if I know that an opponent likes to play a certain opening against d4, a certain opening against e4 that I like to play against, I might go with that. But in a vacuum, I decided to play knight f3. He plays knight f6, and now I play c4. This is kind of my solid repertoire with white. And here my opponent played d6. Now, I was a little surprised by this. I mean, this move doesn't have really a whole lot of independent value. Normally, players who play the King's Indian will basically play something like g6 on move 2. And I think in many cases d6 isn't really as useful a move as something like c5 or g6. We might be able to play d5 later on in one move. It may be more useful to play c5 in one move rather than d6. So this sort of surprised me a bit. So here I could play several moves. Decided to play knight c3. I mean, there's nothing wrong with d4. And in passing, I should mention this. Possibility of him going bishop g4 here is interesting. It's not easy to get an active and kind of interesting game against players who play this setup I'm playing here, knight f3 and or c4, usually followed by g3. And so if you do encounter the English opening or knight f3, I think an interesting and aggressive approach is to play something like d6 with the idea of bishop g4. It's not objectively a great opening for black, but I think it's one of the only ways that you can kind of take the typical knight f3 c4 player out of his sort of comfort zone. But anyway, I just wanted to mention that because, I mean, that's something he could try here, actually. After both knight c3 and or d4, he could play bishop to g4. But he plays g6, and so we transpose to the King's Indian. Now, I've played many different systems against the King's Indian, but I haven't really studied very deeply the theory in a long time. And as I'm playing an older player, I wasn't too worried about being outplayed by the opening theory in the early stages, but you never know. I mean, it's possible. Even a 70-year-old guy could have been studying his opening theory. But I played d4 here. He plays bishop g7. I mean, the nice thing about d6 for me is that I don't have to worry about the Grunfeld defense. Basically, black's options are limited to play a kind of King's Indian or Old Indian type formation. After d6, that is. But here, I decided that, again, not having the ability to prepare before the game, I was going to avoid a sort of theoretical line. Objectively, White's best move was e4 in this position. The second best move was probably g3. Look here at the opening explorer. e4, almost universal. You get g3 sometimes, and the occasional bishop g5, bishop f4. I played bishop g5. This is called the Smyslov system, and I did play this a lot. I did some videos for chesslecture.com years ago, a site I still work for, and I do recommend subscribing over there, but it is a pay site. But anyway, the series I did on the Smyslov system is a little dated. It was probably 4 or 5 years ago or more, but it's something that doesn't really, the theory doesn't really change. I'm going over like general ideas of this opening, but basically the philosophy behind this is that White isn't really trying to get an opening advantage. It's more like playing a kind of position that you're comfortable with, and perhaps your opponent is not. The first thing about the move is that it doesn't involve playing e4. Typically, we're going to play a pawn structure where we play a more reserved pawn formation with e3, but getting the bishop outside the pawn chain. This can also be used with colors reversed as an antidote to the King's Indian attack, for example. I mean, you could argue that White's setup is kind of like a defense in reverse, practically. But a lot of King's Indian players, especially those who are not professionals, are a little put off by the system because of two factors. First of all, White isn't playing e4, so the structure's a little more amorphous and something they're not quite used to. And secondly, bishop g5, basically, anytime White plays bishop g5 in the King's Indian, this move, creating the potential of a pin on the knight, on the queen on d8, anytime we play this move, whether it's the same-ish variation or the Averbach or anything else like h3 and bishop g5 or Petrosian system, they all have the same thing in common, that they really kind of discourage variations where Black plays e5. And that's no different here. It seems that against bishop g5, I think the best variations for Black involve basically playing a Benoni with c5 or some kind of other amorphous setup, as I've played myself with Black, like a6, c6, b5, knight bd7, bishop b7, something like that, something flexible. Whereas the e5 systems look like they're kind of not as effective as they would be against e4 setups for White. All right, so let's get rid of these arrows here. Key castles, and as I said, I think the Benoni is the best antidote to bishop g5, but Black has played d6 already, and in a pure world, I think that probably the best line for Black is to just not play d6 at all, and even just c5 in one go. If I hadn't played d6 here, Black hadn't played d6 already, he could just play c5 in one go. But here we are. So I played e3. This is this typical idea. And I don't want to play e4. I could play e4, but that would be more of a classical King's Indian. And so here I expect Black to play, I don't know, a c5, knight bd7, h6 and g5 is always possible, hunting down my bishop. It's a very principled approach. But he played instead here knight a6. And this move kind of threw me, because I'm not sure I've ever faced this move in this exact position before. And the trick is, I guess, if I'm to move here, should I play bishop e2? Really, there's no other move. I mean, I think I actually had a game against FIDE master Paul McIntyre in a similar position once where he played c5, I played d5, and then he played knight a6. It isn't all that much different, but I could play knight bd2 there, knight fd2 there. See here, there's games like Goldin, Rostemov, some good players. But going back here to the position, let me go back here. We're in the wrong position here. So knight a6 right away. It's an interesting move. And again, my opponent J.Havasi Janos, FIDE master. He's only rated around 2150, but about 70 years old. Not too bad to be 150 points off of his peak. I was impressed by him in this game. He also played very, very quickly. So I played bishop e2 for lack of a better move, basically. And now c5. And the problem here for white is you can play Smyslov style in this position, per se, by not playing d5. This would be the normal way to play. But objectively, this position is equal. After castles, bishop f5, I don't think that white really has much better than this text move here. We see bishop d3, with a very, very tiny advantage to white. There's a few games, Conquest, Stelagan draw, Pachman Re draw, and there's a game from 1994 where white won. But it's not a very interesting position, and white just sort of trading pieces here. So I really think that I prefer to play a more risky move in this position, which is instead of bishop e2 castles, just d5. Now, this is black's last chance to play for the bishop pair, and I think that h6 is a good move, but it's not everyone's style. h6, bishop h4, g5. Here's a couple of games. Bishop g3, and now I think knight h5. Typical plan. Knight d2. And we've got a game, two games. Knight takes g3, h takes g. This is a very typical position where normally maybe black wouldn't have the knight on a6. I had some blitz games with some very strong players, like not only blitz games, I think I might have played with John Nunn in blitz, where he has got the knight on e6 and knight d7. I also played Mihai Marin, again with the knight back on b8, playing for e6 and knight d7. But the knight on a6 is a little bit different. Still, nevertheless, I mean, the knight has several routes into the position, and I think this position is perfectly okay for black. You see, his bishop on g7 is so powerful that it offsets the fact that he's weakened his king side. And just while we're here talking about this position, out of curiosity, if you're wondering why I started playing this line for white, I actually played it, the position with black, and once lost sometime in the mid-90s. I remember once I lost to Boris Golko very, very badly with black. And that was the day that I decided to start playing the system for white. So I felt very uncomfortable with black. Anyway here, so d5, and then he plays knight c7. Apparently this has been played before, but this is my critical moment here, where I'd like to stop h6, g5, knight h5, but at the same time, he's threatening a Benko-style play with b5. And once in the very distant past, again, probably in the late 90s, I had a game against my old friend Alexander Vojtkovich. He played a similar sort of setup against me, where he was able to break with b5 very quickly. And that's something that white should be careful about. So, if we play routinely here, let's say knight d2, then this is very similar to my game with Vojtkovich, where I think he sacked a pawn with something like b5. And I think this is fully playable for black. I did, in fact, play something along these lines, like bishop takes f6, which the engine recommends here. Bishop takes f6, bishop takes f6, pawn takes pawn. When black has Benko-style counterplay, and I think that it's not a fantasy. I mean, black really has pretty good compensation for the sacrificed pawn around here. And this bishop it's a long-term asset for black, so I think this is fully playable. I was scared of b5, so I wanted to restrict that. I decided to play a4 in the actual game. But once again, black should consider playing h6, g5, knight h5, etc. He didn't seem interested. Goes back to a6, and this is apparently a new move. But it's very logical, inducing the weakness on b4 and then going back with the knight to a6 and b4. And very resolute. Now I played knight to d2 to stop h6, g5, knight h5, so I don't lose my bishop. And he plays knight b4. And at this point, now I'm going to need to support my center. So you can castle, but I think that e4 is fine too. He's wasted some time with his knight, and I wasted my pawn move twice e3, e4. So this is an interesting game, and I think that it's balanced here. My opponent now plays knight e8, and I got a lot of arrows on the board, but I'm basically showing you guys, this looks like at first sight a passive move for black, and I was taken aback, but it's a very interesting move because he wants to play an early f5, and this is generally like in Benko type of positions, any sort of Benoni. F5 is a risky move for black, but I think that in this situation, the fact that his knight is on b4, which sort of disrupts the harmony in my position a little bit, it controls these squares, c2, d3. If he can play f5 and get a bishop out on f5, he's going to have tremendous threats on this diagonal, f5, b1. So there's a certain coordination, and plus he gets a bishop on f5 with f5 capture, and then the bishops are both raking these diagonals very well. So it's actually a strange looking move at first sight, knight e8, but it's making sense. And now here, I castled, he plays f5, and I missed the best line for white here at this point. But it involves sacrificing a pawn. And it's easy to say retrospectively, like, oh yeah, I should have done that. But if we look, I'm not concerned about pawn takes, because I think that blocks his bishop on c8. What I was concerned was if I take, he plays bishop takes f5, but this is really strong for white. And this is what I underestimated. With this plan, I would have held a slight advantage. And my fear was that I lose a pawn and I might not have enough compensation. But if we look here a little further, take, bishop takes, rook b1, and I had the ability to shift this rook across laterally, rook b3, rook h3. All of my pieces can attack on the king side, bishop g4, bishop e6. It's just a great attacking position for white, and ultimately I might be able to play f4, f5. So all of white's pieces are just harmonious, coordinated, and this would have been a great line. He doesn't have to take the pawn. In fact, retrospectively, thinking about my opponent's style, he's an aggressive, non-materialistic kind of player. I don't think he would have taken that pawn on b2. But nevertheless, it was my best plan. And I made a very serious mistake here by not playing pawn takes f5. I played instead f4, because you may not notice it right away. Black is starting to win a piece in this position with h6, g5, and f4, trapping my bishop. So I really have to do something, and f3 is just a passive move. So if you look at the engine here, it's either take or f4. There are no other alternatives for white. I played f4, and now it looks like a 4 pawns attack Benoni, which is something I have some experience with both sides. a6, and now king h1, a good prophylactic move. Rook b8. And here at this point, I made a very, very unusual move. I thought, well, it's okay to think outside the box sometimes. I'll play something creative. I know it looks weird. But in retrospect, I probably would have played h3, which is a useful move, giving my king another hiding square, giving me better control and ability to play maybe g4, keeping pieces off of g4. Another interesting idea, though, is rook a3 with the river guarding rook. This is a classic Benoni maneuver. Very, very natural move. But instead I played rook to c1. This is kind of a clumsy move. It's not a typical square for the rook. And it's not really about defending the knight from bishop takes c3. It's not about the rook itself. It's about stopping knight c2. So I wanted to actually activate my queen in a classic sort of attacking mechanism. Queen e1, Dutch style. Queen e1, queen h4, queen e1, queen g3. So I could mobilize all my pieces. But it's very clumsy. You know, I think h3 or a5 or rook a3 would have been more natural. Black plays knight c7 now, and here I have a number of choices. I decided to play queen e1, threatening queen h4. My opponent plays h6, and now I think I'm still doing fine, but he found a star move here, queen e8. And this is where the game turns momentarily. Everything was fine. I have more space, and his knight on b4 is a little hard to justify. But with this move, queen e8, first of all, he has some Dutch-like ideas. Typical Leningrad Dutch. Queen coming out this diagonal. It has mobility on this diagonal. It helps supporting b5, key break. It supports e6, key break. And it gets out of the pin. The most important thing about queen e8 in this cagey old Videi master, it gets out of the pin of the bishop on h4. And now I really have to be very, very careful. And I wasn't careful enough. So it looks like we have to find a5 or h3, some kind of useful move. That doesn't really have any downsides. I can play a5, and if he plays b5, I take en passant on b6. It's fine. I would like to play e5, but it's just difficult to see how this works. The computer comes up with some sort of line here. D takes e5, f takes e5. I mean, I just didn't see any discoveries in this position. But Stockfish just sacrifices a pawn for sort of negligible compensation, and then like bishop f2. This is really interesting. So this happens in the same-ish King's Indian sometimes with bishop g5. An e5 sacrifice to get at this pawn on c5. Actually, in the same season I had a game with black against Tot Ervin, where he did this sort of thing with white. I got a good game with black though, grabbing that pawn on e5 in exchange for the pawn on c5. You know, something like b6, a5, levering his whole structure. And the whole Benoni structure may fall apart. But anyway, this is very obscure, very, very crazy and complicated. I didn't consider that, but I should have played something constructive, a5, h3, or even g4. This move, part of the reasons why I'm playing king h1, I mean, we'd like to play g4 to actually open the g file and attack black down the g file. And g4 is not necessarily a bad move. I think here, though, I have to watch out for this, knight g3. So I considered this as a sort of temporary pawn sacrifice, something like this, this, and this. Maybe h3. It's very interesting. And perhaps if I had more time, I could justify some kind of attack like this. Or if it was a blitz game, I could just do it. But I just wasn't sure about it. So we played a different move here. Pawn takes pawn. And unfortunately, this move just seems to kind of help black to develop. That's the main problem. He doesn't really want to take with the pawn. If he takes with the pawn, I can play queen e1, and it's very much like a Petrosian King's Indian. I get bishops on h4 and h5, which is very, very nasty. He has to take with the bishop. But this has sort of helped him to develop. And now my best move, I mean, I'm really concerned about b5 at this point, or possibly e6. My best move, maybe knight on d to e4. But he's got b5 breaks, for example, breaking my center. Now perhaps I could just react to something like b5 with b3. Just go on about my business. Let's take a look here. Or even AB, AB, b3. We could just go on about our business because this knight on b4 literally doesn't have anywhere to go. Which is very kind of funny. But I took a risk here that I regret now. Although the computer thinks it's okay. I have to find a very, very active follow-up to this. Now, he didn't have the gumption to play bishop c2. I would have been a little unconvinced by that as well. It's not really clear what you do after bishop c2, queen g3, for example. I wasn't sure. But going back to d7 seems reasonable. And here, again, I really have to be very quick. There is an interesting pawn sacrifice with f5, but I didn't see that it's all that clear, really, where my compensation is. So apparently, I should have played knight on d to e4 here, trying to talk him out of e6, basically. So my fears were misplaced in this position. I mean, black has two breaks. Two breaks. One is b5, classic Benoni type position. One is e6. But if we take the time to realize that anytime he does b5, I can just play b3 and kind of keep the position locked. Or AB, AB, b3. for example, then this move becomes the superior. We allow b5, trying to discourage e6 in this position. So b5, let's just say a takes b, b3 in this position. Black would have to get reorganized to something like rook a8 in order to activate queenside counterplay. So this was a major mistake here, what I did. I stopped the b5 break, but I didn't do anything. I disarmed it a little bit. I didn't stop it, but I disarmed it. But I didn't do anything to stop e6, and it was tragedy. I mean, my king is totally exposed on this diagonal. And I went to my team captain, you know, in the middle of the game. It's allowed to talk to your team captain. And I said, look, I think there's a good chance I'm in trouble here, you know. So, I don't know. We have to really win some other games because I was worried about my position. He didn't play e6 here. And this move is absolutely unbelievable. It's absolutely forced by, you know, by Black. I mean, he should have realized how really important this is. I mean, to break the center, to get yourself so that you're not backward along the file, and also to open up a line against my king on h1. I think that if my king had the ability to go to h2, if I had h3 in this position already played, white would have a good game. But because my king doesn't have a safe place to go, if it gets checked on the diagonal, and there's a really neat idea here. I saw a variation now, knight on d to e4, e takes d, knight takes d6, and there's this fantastic queen sacrifice variation that the computer came up with. All forced, more or less forced. Queen e6, c takes d, and then this is really cool. Queen takes knight, knight e4, queen takes pawn, bishop c4. So if we count the material here, I just won basically queen for 2 pieces. And Black is winning here, believe it or not. The Black coordination is so good in this example variation that he's just nearly winning. Bishop takes d5. Maybe winning is an exaggeration, but nearly winning. Because the Black pieces, every one, like this rook is coming over here to e8. Every single one of the Black pieces, my king is on h1, threatened by this bishop on the c6, h1 diagonal. The knight is forking me at d3. All of his pieces are active and his king is safe. So it's just an unbelievable position where, I mean, I just intuitively felt that I would be probably close to lost if Black just simply played e6. And that will end up being his only chance to win this game. So he misses it. He plays queen f7. And this move is too slow. And I could have and should have played f5 immediately here. I think f5 immediately is quite strong. If pawn takes f5, pawn takes f5, bishop takes f5, and I don't know why I disregarded this variation. Bishop g4. Perhaps I saw this and I wasn't 100% sure what was going on. Like bishop takes g4. I don't remember now if I feared this queen sacrifice. Perhaps. I just saw some variations that I thought were not all that clear, and I decided to kind of prepare f5 instead of playing it immediately, which is probably okay. So I played knight on d to e4, and then Black now has a problem because e6 is no longer nearly as good as it was. Since I can take on d6, trapping his queen, obviously, that's not really not really an option, you know, trapping the queen on f7. So he's got a problem now. There's no effective break, and b5 is limited since I can take en passant. So Black went from a great position, nearly winning, to worse in one move with queen f7. And it was funny because my team captain came back after I told him I was nearly lost. He looks at the position and I could see he was kind of confused, like, what's wrong, you know? Well, my opponent's window of victory was probably basically one move because he didn't find e6. Now I take back what I said, and I'm now better again. This was a terrible move. rook f e8, and then we should have played f5, but I was a little bit too fancy here. I should play f5 or queen d2. Queen d2 is like a multifaceted move. It connects the rooks, it protects b2, it guards against bishop d4, e3, it supports this diagonal. Instead I played queen d1, which was like basically kind of a cheapo. I wanted to create sort of threats against h5. This was a very bad idea. It's not a terrible move, but you know, on a scale of 1 to 10 compared to queen d2, it's much, much worse. So I wasn't thinking too clearly here. I was very upset that he had e6 earlier, and I still don't think I had really regained my composure. I played queen d1, and now black has b5, getting a little bit of counterplay, take en passant, rook takes, and now f5. There will be no second chance. This game should be strategically over at this point. But there's a difference between a winning position and winning a position. Having a winning position, everyone says, I was winning, I had a winning position. But actually executing a winning position is a different story. It's easy to kind of write your opponent off and say, yeah, I mean, this is over, it's won. But you have to actually execute. And here he plays g5. I played bishop g3, and then bishop d4, which was a good try. You know, he's got some complicating moves with bishop e3. Once again, queen d2 is a good move. I decided to play h4, and he should take on h4, which would possibly transpose to the game. It's better that he, you know, he has to give up some control of the position, but it's better he doesn't let me take on g5, because when he lets me take on g5, he has a concrete isolated pawn that's a weakness on g5. He takes on h4 is a better practical chance. Queen g7. Now, I make a mistake. I should have played hg, and my first intuition was to take king g2 and try to checkmate him. This is what I would have done in a blitz game, but I was afraid of putting my king a little bit on the same rank here with the pawn on b2 because of some possible breakthroughs by black on b2, maybe some tactics with rook takes b2, and I became kind of paranoid at the last minute. But chess should be about concrete calculation. I was, however, in a little bit of time pressure. I play this, he takes on h4, I take on h4, and now we have this massive threat of f6, which will just annihilate black in one move. So it's easy to find the right move for black here. Rook f8. And I missed the best move, knight g3, which looks a bit strange. I mean, you have a knight in a dominant position, but we can free the square, bring the other knight to e4, and go with g3, h5 with the first knight. This was a very, very strong plan. Basically, I'm going to get another piece attacking f6. Instead, I played rook f3. I wanted to get my rooks toward the king side, but he defends. Knight e8, rook f1, and then here. And now I really wanted to bring pressure to bear on h6, but I was getting in time pressure. Perhaps bishop takes f6. I didn't want to give up the dark squared bishop, honestly. But if I'm going to win a clear pawn here, maybe this variation deserves some consideration. I'm not sure. I just was very reticent to give up my dark squared bishop. So, rook h3, knight takes e4, knight takes e4, and now this player who I thought, you know, was just nearly lost, comes up with the best practical defense I've ever seen in an extremely difficult position. I mean, most people would not find this. You know, he sacks a piece here with knight takes d5, and it's brilliant. I mean, objectively, like a computer would win this position easily for white. But on a practical level, this is the only move that poses any problems for white, and he finds it in time pressure. Both of us in time pressure at this point, with basically 8 moves to make the time control. So, a class sacrifice. And white has to be careful. Pawn takes knight, rook takes b2. I have no idea if it's better to play queen d1 or queen e1. It was kind of hard to decide. The engine doesn't really know either. Played queen e1, and now the computer wants to play rook takes e2. The problem with that, although maybe objectively it's the best move, you're trading pieces. Rook takes e2, queen takes e2, bishop b5, queen f3, bishop takes f1, queen takes f1. You're trading down in a situation where you only have 2 pawns for a piece. So, objectively, I think it's not enough, and my opponent's decision here to keep more complications in the position. Queen e5. And now, according to the engine, the best move is bishop c4. But I was in a position where I thought the bishop on c4 was awkwardly placed. It should be closer to my king, guarding squares around my king. So I played the second best move here, bishop f3. Either way, I have to protect this pawn on d5. What bothered me about bishop c4 was basically, I guess, the exposed nature of that piece, that I don't really have, any way to protect the bishop on c4 if it's attacked. And I felt very insecure about that. So bishop f3, and now bishop e5, and I was in very bad time pressure with like 4 moves to make the time control, and failed here after the next move. Bishop g3, driving his queen back, queen g7, and again now 4 moves to make the time control. I missed the boat here. I'm losing the exchange. I've already had my opponent sacrifice a piece for 2 pawns, but at this point I'm losing the exchange, which means that he's now going to restore material equality. He's going to win a rook for a bishop, one of those bishops, and that will give him 2 pieces for a rook and 2 pawns. So the question is which piece to give up, which rook to give up for which bishop. Well, I guess it's got to be the f rook, but the best move is apparently bishop f4. This variation was nearly impossible to see. By the way, bishop f4, bishop takes f1, queen takes f1. When everything hinges on an unbelievable sequence here, rook takes h6, with the idea of rook g6, and rook b1, bishop d1, defending. But this is really, with a human player in time pressure, I didn't really look at variations where I put myself into a self-pin with bishop d1. It's very uncomfortable. So at this point, basically, in time pressure, I also could have played rook f2, I think. Let me see. Rook f2, which looks scary because of several things. I mean, he can give up this bishop on f2, and his queen becomes more active. There's also the possibility of the rook coming over and getting down on b1 later. But apparently this would have been a reasonable try. I can take back with a knight. My king is actually very safe, and I have some lateral threats with the queen along the e-file. So I had 2 superior moves to what I did. I blundered here with rook h2, and my thinking was a general one. The problem with generalizing, it's just not as good as concrete analysis. Just general, getting in time pressure down to a minute now. General thinking was eliminate his most active piece. This is just for the sake of the safety of my king. I wanted to eliminate that rook on the 7th rank. But it was the wrong idea. Bishop takes f1, rook takes b2, bishop takes b2, and queen takes f1. I'm still fine, but I'm no longer winning. And he has 2 pawns and a rook for 2 pieces. h5 is a move I didn't see. It looks kind of dangerous for both sides. He's also in time pressure, and at this point, again, a player who's not a materialist plays bishop e5. I mean, if he plays a5, I can invade his position with queen b5 on the white squares. I'm not sure he wants to do that. So he decides to give back a pawn. I play my 40th move, and I've kind of just resigned myself to the fact that this game is a draw. I basically was very angry with myself, but you just got to accept, sometimes you make a mistake. alright, this guy's going to draw, there's nothing I can do. And then I came back, or it was move 40, and he played this. And I was like, wow. That's interesting, because now my bishop can go to h4, and I suddenly can avoid exchanging pieces and keep his queen kind of tied up. And now black made a terrible blunder. This is the bane of older players. I mean, they tend to get tired, I know, because I'm old, but the older you are, the more tired you get in the later stages of the game. So this is like move 41, and my opponent makes what I would call like his only real blunder of the game. I mean, in a sense, like bishop f4, allowing f6. And I didn't really seriously consider any moves here for black, allowing pawn takes e7. So he plays pawn takes f6. And this is a key position where now I had time, and I start to show the signs of being a little bit tired myself. My first idea was to play knight takes f6 check, but there is no really great follow-up to knight takes f6 check. Knight takes f6 check, king h8, and then what? You know, it's a situation where I have to be very careful about my own king. His queen and his rook are both very active. So it would have been best to play knight takes d6, which is what I was going to play until the last moment when I changed my mind. Basically, knight takes d6 creates a very powerful passed pawn for white, finally taking out the Benoni pawn on d6, stops queen b7, and threatens knight f5, which is tremendous outpost near the black king. He can't afford to give up the bishop. This kind of ending is just game over. My two bishops will protect my king, and I have a very strong passed pawn that just wins. So I missed the boat there. I got tempted by a different move here. Bishop takes f6, and I thought, well, it's just really, I have nice attacking chances. I'll pull the bishop back and be able to play knight f6 check, and all my pieces will filter in and checkmate the black king. What I missed was queen b7. And as I was sitting there to my horror, and realizing that queen b7 probably holds the game for black, he didn't exchange queens. He didn't try to exchange queens with queen b7. This is a guy who wanted to try to win, you know, so it's like against his credo to trade queens. But sometimes you just have to resign yourself, like I said before. Maybe he wanted to win, so that's why he didn't trade queens, but he has to. This is the only move that doesn't lose for black, period. The queen b7 probably holds on, but instead he played queen c7, and that gives me the time to win, just barely. Bishop c3, and now he realized the danger. Knight f6, I've got very, very strong attacking chances with the queen coming back, and now he played it, but it's too late. He lost the full tempo. And I make another mistake here. It should be queen e2 right away, and it's almost like pulling a rubber band back and then building up momentum and then firing it, you know. All my pieces after queen e2 would be poised to strike. Maximum defensive and offensive potential here for white with a winning position. But instead I play knight f6 check first, and I become a little bit off balance. After king f7, I thought, well, I'm still winning, no problem, queen e2, but there is a problem. The text move in the game wasn't good enough. He missed this move, which is just amazing, bishop e5. And it looks like bishop e5 saves the game. Strange as it is. Bishop takes e5, d takes e5, and I have to bring the knight back. If I try to take this pawn, he has the crushing queen b1 check, king h2, queen b2 check, trading queens and winning the knight on f6. So I lose my coordination for just a moment. I would have to agree to an equal position here, retreating my knight back to e4. And this looks like an ending that it's pretty close. It's probably a draw. White has to be careful not to lose here, actually. I looked at this a little bit. We have to be very, very careful not to lose. But I don't think I was lost. Just it was a draw. But instead he played the more natural move, queen e7. This is almost good for black too. There's just one little detail that loses the game for black. That is queen d3, bishop e5, and he's got this nasty threat down here, queen h4, if my knight moves. And bishop takes e5, by the way. Queen takes e5. Maybe a draw of some kind. Let's see. Bishop takes e5, queen takes e5, knight d7, queen e1 check. It looks like I can walk away. King g2, rook b2 check, king h3, and now he doesn't have any more threats. The best the computer come up with is some sort of draw. Wow, that's amazing. Perpetual, knight f6, king takes f6, queen f5 check. Huh. And a draw by repetition, king g7, queen d7 check. Really funny. So this would lead to a draw. So he had missed a draw, and now I have to find the only move, g5. And this actually was a move that I wanted to play for a long time, but found the perfect moment. And opening up the additional threat of bishop h5 decides black's actually getting mated. Not only do I deny him queen h4 and defend my knight on f6, I'm opening up the devastating entry of the bishop on h5, and black has just lost. So it was really kind of a cute finish for black here. He played the only move really. If he takes on g5, bishop h5 check, king takes f6, and queen g6 mate. There is no defense. So really back and forth game that objectively could have been better for black, could have been a draw many different ways, and I managed to get lucky here and win. Bishop h5 check, king f8, and then bishop takes e5. This works now. He doesn't have any checks. He can't take with the queen because of knight d7. He must take with the pawn, and now I simply play d6. But according to the engine, I have even better moves. Queen f5, queen g6 are all winning. But this is the most straightforward. And here, this is not the position. 1 second. Actual game. Bishop takes e5, d takes e5. Sorry. That was a different variation. King f8, bishop takes e5, d takes e5. This is the game. The pawns are there. And now d6. Yeah, excuse me. After g5, I was looking at instead another line here. Yes, g takes h, h takes g, bishop h5 check, king f8. This position I was looking at, but bishop takes, d takes, and now here, yes, I have to play queen g6. Queen g7. And then a very beautiful move, like only move too, queen f5. Threatening every kind of discovery. And the most beautiful position is probably this. King here, queen d7 check. If king f6, queen e6 mate. If king f8, queen d6 check, picking up his rook on b8, winning everything and mating by force. Queen e7, queen takes b8 check. It's just forced mate in a few moves. So really lucky finish for me. Finding g5. And but anyway, like a really instructive game. g5, no move here. King f8, bishop takes e5. In this position I meant to say queen f5 is the best move, but d6 is good enough, and he resigned here. So this was W.Paschall Team Championship, my game with white against FIDE master J.Havasi Janos. A really messy affair. I mean, I really thought that I played pretty aggressively with advancing on my pawns and attacking on the king's side. It wasn't a low-risk game, but there were a lot of inaccuracies by both sides. Black could have played e6 with a clear advantage in the late opening, and we certainly made a lot of inaccuracies toward the end. But I learned a lot by analyzing this game in depth, and that's the idea. So please subject your own games to a deep analysis. This is probably the best way to improve your game. I'm International Master William Paschall. Thanks for joining me here on my YouTube channel, Video Chess Training, for this in-depth review of my own game. Take care, guys. See you later. Bye-bye.